Hi there and welcome back. This is the second in a series of recordings that I'm doing called Learning the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War System. In the last episode I went over the general overview of the game, gave you a little bit of history about it, and we took a look at the playing pieces. In this episode, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to show you another online resource to get you started, and I'm going to take I'm going to give a walking tour or an overview of the actual Vassal module here. And then we're going to talk about the initiative and the action cycle. That is, all the things that you can do on your turn. We'll just talk about the flow of the game. So let's get started, shall we? Before I actually get in on the Vassal module here, as promised, I think what I want to do with each of these recordings is to start off with just some online information, perhaps either from the gaming community or something through Board Game Geek or Consim World, just to kind of show you where a lot of the additional resources are for learning this game. That was a great start for me when I was first learning it, and I think there's a wealth of potential out there for you. So today, or for this recording, I don't know if it's day or night for you, what I'm going to do is first show you the actual site hosted by Multiman Publishing. This is it's right online, and it's called the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War.com or GCACW.com. And as you can see here, what we're looking at is all of the primary information that is available to you. Specifically, what I want to point out here is the actual standard series rules that have been available for almost a decade now. With the advent of the title Grant Takes Command, it was decided that all the previous modules could be integrated together with a series of standardized rules, and so with that title they released one brand new rule book that covered all of the actions and activities that we're going to talk about in this particular recording, but it standardized everything so that there were now no problems with newer players playing older titles and having to unlearn or differentiate between rules that came along in subsequent titles. Now, if you're watching this, and well, obviously you're watching it, but if you've jumped in at the point of Battle Above the Clouds, then you know that packaged with your copy of that, there's the Standard Series Rules 1.1. So that is the most current, and I believe what Ed Beach and company are going to be doing with the re-release of Stonewall Jackson's Way is they're going to give you version 1.2 with some additional tweaks. But just to get started, you can go right online to the Great Campaigns site here, and they have some PDFs available for you. This is the one that you should go ahead and get started with and download that. When you open it up, as you see, it is a PDF, and it's got the cover from Grant Takes Command. But everything that you'll need to know just to get started is right here. And this is what we are doing in these recordings. I'm just going through step by step and trying to give you specific examples using the Vassal module for each of these concepts. And none of them are very difficult, but for a novice player they can be a little tricky. So you can see in the table of contents right here, the Standard Basic Game Rules Index. This is going to cover all of the information that I want to go through in each of these recordings. At this point, I've covered the 2.0, the basic game concepts, and some of the playing pieces. So to give you an idea of where we are for this episode, what I'm going to talk about is the basic game sequence of play and the action cycle. And if we have a little bit of time, I will go over the module. Actually, I think I'm going to do the module information first, and we'll talk about the different action types. So what you could expect for this recording is to go from 3.0 here all the way down to 5.5. And then starting with episode 3 and 4, 3 will cover march and movement and all of the specifics about terrain and its effects on how you move your armies around. And then in the next episode, in episode 4, I will talk about combat specifically, and I'll probably look at just the first half of combat, the actual die roll modifiers up through, say, 7.5 here, and then the more specific stuff, the retreats and routes and then cavalry retreats, I'll address a little bit later on because they add a layer of complexity to it. And I think I just want you to get started with the die roll modifiers and how a simple attack will commence. So that's what we're going to do from here on out, and I will keep coming back to this index in each of the episodes so that you have an idea of where you are for that particular recording. So let's head back over to the Vassal module, and I will give you that overview first. Also this time, I think what I'm going to do is, I noticed in the previous recording that the resolution was a little hard to see when I went back and watched it, so on this one and all the ones to follow, I'm going to go in with a little bit higher zoom resolution so that you can really see these pieces jump out at you. And those of you with lower resolution screens will hopefully not have as many issues with squinting or just seeing some fuzziness. And part of that is when it records and encodes it into YouTube. I think that's causing some of the issue, but hopefully we will alleviate that with a higher zoom level here. Will allow me to point out the wonderful design of this Battle Above the Clouds module for the Vassal system. This was created by Rob Doan, and it is probably one of the best looking and best interactive modules that I've used in the Vassal environment, and it shows if you have the interest and the love of a particular gaming system, you can really make a very excellent module, and this is no exception here. I'm just going to look at the tools here and just give you an idea. Some of these are going to be a little foreign to you until you have an idea of how the game works, but I at least want to give you the idea of what kind of automation's been built in here. So most of these are pretty standard. I'm going to start on this end down here where we have the die rollers. In this game, you're only going to be really using two sets of dice. You're either going to use a d6, the 1d6 here, or a 2d6. And those are going to handle all your movement, and you can use them either one at a time, or you can use the 2d6 for the cavalry movement, or depending on if you're playing this by email, sometimes it's helpful to do both die rolls at one time for the Union and the Confederate. And there's a convention that people use when playing by email of, first die is the Union, second die is the Confederate, so that can help expedite things a little bit. Down here on the far right you see the zoom tools, so I can zoom out a bit here, and I think, like I said earlier, that's part of the problem we were having with earlier recording. So in this one I'm going to take us all the way into the full zoom 100%. I can hide the individual counters, so if I need to see a particular label on a map, I can just make those disappear, and I could toggle them on and off. Rob has also packaged a variety, well, actually all the charts that you'll need to play the Great Campaign system, specifically those that are related to here in the Battle Above the Clouds. So if you click on this button here, the charts, or hit F6, open it up, and you can see each of the tabs have all of the primary information that you're going to need. And this is what I'm going to be going through. We'll refer back to these quite often. You have the terrain effects, the movement, the combat chart, the specific modifiers that we'll use in the combat resolution, the retreat priorities, and that's going to be an episode unto itself because that is probably the most challenging learning aspect of this game for new users, and the cavalry retreat modifiers. But everything you'll need is right here. This is also what's included in that PDF, and there are additional PDF charts right there on that multi-man site, so that all of these, if you want a hard copy of them, you can have those at your disposal too. You can see that there are also force charts here if you want to streamline the stacks that are on the map. There's both a Union one there and a Confederate one. And then there are additional charts here for reinforcements, and those are usually based on a particular scenario that you may be playing. So you can see a much more complex one for the Confederate side. You've got your county overview map. Most of this will certainly not come into play for anything but the campaign, the larger campaign, which is several turns. So that's representing the entire Chattanooga campaign. And then you have a county control display, again, that comes in the larger one. A lot of this has been automated, so that as you're playing this in a live session, or even by email, a lot of the things that we would have to normally remember to do are automated through here, and that just makes this fantastic. And you can also take a screenshot and save it as a PNG. There is the turn track, which you'll use for the different ones, and anytime you have reinforcements, you can see hoods stack is here, and depending on what the conditions are, you may get your reinforcements on a particular turn. And if all else being equal, like the standard Vassal modules, you have access to all the individual markers and pieces that you could use to place on the map if you need to. Much of this has been automated just by right-click functionality. So as I showed in the previous recording, if I come down here and I right-click on Davidson, I can place a lot of these markers directly onto him just through the nature of doing this right-click functionality. But the extra game pieces are there just in case. And then by far the most useful, the most helpful ones are at the end of a standard turn, which we're going to talk about in this one. You have to do a recovery phase, and this recovery button here is set for a standard turn. And then if there's a rain turn, there are certain activities that do not take place, such as the building of fortifications. And so Rob has programmed in a standard one and a rain one just so that you could use them, and it will take care of all of the recovery functions. It will remove the fatigue or reduce the fatigues. It will flip over disorganized units to organized if they're qualified for it, and quite a few other things. So it is just a one-stop automation for a lot of the tedium that you would have to do normally when you're playing it face-to-face. Alright, well, now that we've looked at the workings of the Vassal module, let's talk about the initiative and the action cycle for this game. The Great Campaigns of the American Civil War system is not your standard I go, you go war game that so many of us are probably familiar with. It is initiative dependent, meaning that for every action that you perform at the end of that period of time, when you're finished with the action, both sides will roll that d6, and then the high roller will get to perform the next action. So some people are dismayed by the fact that it is possible, if you get hot dice in your favor, that you will constantly get to perform subsequent actions one after another. But there is a downside to that, because in certain scenarios you have limited options of things that you can do, and you don't necessarily want to perform several actions all at once. So we'll see some times when that is not the optimal situation. But the standard activity is you roll a die, the high roller gets to either perform one of the actions that we're going to talk about in a minute, or he may pass the initiative over to the other player, and that person would get to perform an action exactly as if he had won the dice roll himself. Now, if he opts not to and also passes, well, 2 back-to-back passes by both players will end the turn. And if it is a one-turn scenario, that effectively ends the game. In your longer scenarios that are multi-turn, that would then proceed on to the recovery phase, and then we would reset things and get it all ready for the next day. That's essentially the sun going down on the battlefield, and you're preparing for the next day's battle. So let me give you a couple of examples here. Let's say in the normal convention, the Union rolls the first die, and the Confederate rolls the second die. So if I rolled 2 dice like this, I would get a 6 for the first player, that would be the Union, and a 1 for the Confederate player. That means that the Union player would then have the opportunity to perform his action or pass to the Confederate player. And that's all there is to the initiative cycle. It's very easy. It's just the high die roller, and the one exception to that is in ties. In most of the titles in this series, all the way up until Battle Above the Clouds, the Confederate player will always get the advantage of being the tiebreaker. So on any doubles, the Confederate player would effectively win the initiative by default of their tiebreak. In the Battle Above the Clouds, however, should you roll double 1s, 2s, or 3s, then in the majority of the scenarios, the Union player actually wins the initiative, and if there's a double 6, the Confederate player would then win the initiative. One additional historic wrinkle that's been added to this is the concept of insubordination, and that is derived from anytime double 4s or double 5s are rolled by both of the players, then some of the Confederate Union, or excuse me, the Confederate generals or the actual full corps or individual divisions may become insubordinate. And what that's historically modeling is some of the problems that Bragg had with his command and control here during the Chickamauga campaign. So you can see some of the leaders here. Buckner is one example of a corps commander, and then you've got Hindman down here, who is a division leader. They're in red text, and what that indicates is they are highly insubordinate to Braxton Bragg. And so anytime a 2 4s or 2 5s come up during the initiative roll, you actually have a little sub check that goes on, and the Union player will then designate a particular division or corps commander. In this case, he would roll on Buckner, and he'll roll a 1d6 to see if that corps commander or that particular division becomes insubordinate for the rest of the turn. And essentially what that means is they cannot perform combat that is based on an assault, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. They can still march and attack, but they do so at a penalty. And what happens here, I'll show you, when I put insubordination on Buckner, he gives his little raised fist saying, "No sir, I ain't gonna do it." So that means he's gonna stay in his tent or not follow the orders that have been given to him for the rest of the turn. And that can be quite a hamstring for the Confederate player, and that is a really powerful tool. It is of course luck based, it's completely random, but it is possible for the Union player to really put the screws to the Confederate player by making some of their units and actual complete corps unavailable for an entire turn. And in a one-turn scenario, that's devastating. So what happens if you win the initiative? Well, let me get rid of this insubordination marker here, and if you are lucky enough to get the high roll on the initiative, you have essentially 3 options for your particular side. You can activate a single unit, you can activate a leader, or you can do a series of other activities. The most basic activity that you're going to do with your particular unit, and I'm going to activate Pegram is going to activate Davidson here, and we're going to add a fatigue marker, and they're going to march. And marching is one of the most important aspects of this game because you need to get units from one end of the battlefield to another to prepare them for attack. So marching is one of the most basic ones. We're going to talk about that in depth in episode 3. And I can either activate a specific unit to do that, an individual division, or if a particular corps leader here, say Walker, is available, I can use him by right of his command of his subordinate units to activate several units, all under his command, to do the same action. So if I was going to march them, Walker would activate Gist here, who he's attached to, Liddell, and the reserve artillery, and they would all get an advance in their fatigue, and then they would all perform that same action. So if I am marching him, or marching them, they would all then perform that subsequently. I'd march one at a time until each of them have moved their full movement. I can also, when I activate a leader, perform an assault, which means that they're going to attack the adjacent hex without marching. They're just going to start the entire action ready for combat, and then you would go through and see if that combat actually takes place. The other 2 activities that you can perform are based on an individual division, and they can either burn a railroad station. As you can see up here in Ringgold, I have some units that are sitting right on a little red spot here, and Ringgold is along this red railroad station or railroad line. And anytime there's a red station there, some particular scenarios may give points for actually damaging or destroying railroad stations. So cavalry units can't do it, but you can see B.R. Johnson is here, and he has a very large division, and he could take an opportunity, or he could take one of his actions, advance the fatigue, not move, and then either damage or destroy, meaning they're completely burning it to the ground, a particular railroad station. And the final activity that a division can do is they can perform an entrenchment action, and that is specific only to certain titles that are taking place in or later than 1863. So Battle Above the Clouds does qualify for that. Normally, entrenchment takes place during the recovery phase at the end of the day, where they're getting out their picks and spades, and they're actually digging in for the next day. But it is possible for you to, in this title, a couple of the others, to actually perform an entrenchment action, meaning that what's going to happen is they will place a fatigue marker here, and the unit would then dig in and start building breastworks. And it takes multiple multiple actions to perform that, and in some scenarios or in some titles they actually spend more than one fatigue. They might advance 1 or 2 fatigues depending on the level of entrenchment that they're trying to add to. Alright, well, I think here we are at the about 20 minutes. I think that's a perfect spot. I think we're at a good spot to go ahead and wrap this up. We will move on in episode 3 onto the specifics of the marching action, both for single divisions and multiple divisions. But let's just recap what we've talked about here. I've shown you the Multiman Publishing Great Campaigns page, where you can get all of the materials that you'll need for playing this. You can get the PDF of the standard game rules version 1.0. You can, I went through the Vassal module here just to kind of give you an idea of how some of these buttons work. And then we talked about the initiative and the basic actions that you can perform when you win the initiative. And that's really the heart of the game. Everyone keeps passing initiative back and forth until either both pass or you've used up all of the divisions to fatigue level 4. That doesn't happen as often as you might think, but in some of the smaller scenarios it is possible, either through a sequence of combats that have resulted in a lot of fatigue 4 results, or just folks using the entire set of possibilities for all of their divisions in one day. So come on back for episode 3 and join me. We're going to talk about marching actions and how we get around all of our units from one point of the map to another. And once again, my name's Patrick, and I really appreciate you joining me.